here that we're going to have at this point. So this will actually come back. We're talking about things in heaven, and we're going to be talking about angels that stayed faithful to God and that stayed loyal to God. And we're going to be talking about angels that rebelled against God and failed. So we're going to talk about this reconciliation that includes the earth, but includes all of creation, even cosmic creation. So, starting tonight, question 1, what are angels? And we've talked about a lot of different conceptions that we have. The first couple of weeks, we name things. People think of angels as having wings or floating on clouds. People think of having individual guardian angels. We think of our loved ones when they pass away, becoming angels, getting their wings. I had a really cool, we missed it, I had a really cool clip of guess what movie when it comes to angels and having their wings. It's a Wonderful Life, right? Every time, what is it, a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. That's a popular conception that we have. That angels are also God's warriors, and they protect us and they protect us from harm. There is literally so much material just on angels. I could probably teach the rest of the class just going through the references in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and even the intertestamental period, right, the Apocrypha. And we may think, well, we don't even read this part of the Bible. But the New Testament writers quote parts of it that have to do specifically with angels in Jude chapter 9. So even though it's not scripture, it tells us a little bit at least about what Jews were thinking between the Old Testament and the New Testament about angels. But this week I'm not going to do that. We're going to stay on angels, and particularly the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is a little bit more complicated. The New Testament actually streamlines things and simplifies things for us, because it tends to refer to everything kind of in the same terminology, while the Old Testament has all of these different terms, and if we don't know what to look for, it can be really confusing. So it's going to be really interesting, because at the end of this, I'm going to go through these things that we think of when we think of angels, and I think you're going to be surprised at 2 things. You're going to be surprised at the things that you thought represented angels, that were true of angels, that are not true about angels. I think you'll be surprised about that. And I think you'll be surprised at some of the things that are true about angels that sound like there's no way that they could be true. So it's such a fascinating study to me. And also, I'm going to there are things about angels and demons and the unseen realm that I'm certain about. Like, I'm pretty certain, I think I can point. And tonight is going to be things I'm pretty certain about. That's pretty much the only place that we're hanging out. There are things that I think that's the way that it may be. And there are other things that I just have no idea. I'm just going to show it to you, and we just have to kind of make up our own mind, because the Bible just doesn't really come down and say one thing or the other. And I'll just try to be straight up with you guys. I'm not going to try to convince you of anything that I'm not convinced of. And the really interesting thing, especially about tonight, is we're just going scripture through scripture. And I don't know about for you, but for me, the first time I did this, it blew my mind. So we talked last week about the counsel of God. Something, the divine counsel, something that a lot of us are not that familiar with. We didn't grow up thinking about God having this court of these different beings, this divine host. We know that there are multitudes, and that in the ancient world, they thought the stars in the sky represented the host of God. And so when God makes the promise to Abraham that your offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, some people think he's talking purely about number, but that can also be translated, your offspring will be as the stars in the sky. In other words, his offspring will become that heavenly host that will be in God's presence. We'll talk about that. We're not going to get too deep into that today. We'll talk about that later. But we think about God's host, all of these celestial beings, these things that God has created that live in the heavenly realm, and we know that there are beings that live there, right? We all believe that. We believe God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit right now inhabit that realm. We know that there are angels and there are spirits, and we have evidence of conversations that happen with God. We talked about that last week. Sometimes those divine beings cross over into our realm. Last week, you may remember, we talked about Micaiah from 1 Kings 22. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the different ways that these beings, the different terminology that makes up the nature of the divine council. So the first is spirit. They are spirit. So 1 Kings 22:19, Micaiah, you may remember. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all the multitudes of heaven. Right? How many does it say are in heaven? This is easy. This is easy. I read the answer to you. I'm going to read it one more time. Multitudes. That's right. That's right. When I ask a question, that's what you do. You answer it back. That's a good job. Multitudes. That's what it tells. There are multitudes in heaven. And the Lord said, who will entice Abraham into attacking Ramoth Gilead and going to his death there? One suggested this and another that. Finally, this is in verse 21. And again, I'm going to put this on our website so you'll be able to go track these passages down. Finally, a spirit came forward, stood before the Lord, and said, I will entice him. So we know from this text, they in nature can appear as spirit. I'm just going to have to go one verse at a time because I've got a lot to go through here. And when that spirit shows up, it shows up as a spirit that entices Ahab's prophets to give him bad advice. The next term that's used that describes them is heavenly ones or beings and holy ones. This is the divine council again. So Psalm 89:5, the heavens praise your wonders, Lord, your faithfulness too in the assembly of the holy ones. The assembly of the holy ones. These are the people surrounding God, the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings? So the holy ones and the heavenly beings, that's another two ways. So we know that they're spirit, and that they're holy, they're in the presence of God, and that they're heavenly beings. They are also described as stars. Job, most famous, Job 38, verse 5. Who marked off, or 5 through 7, who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? Now listen to what it says in verse 7. While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. We know there are other divine beings that are given the name morning star. So the divine council is described as spirit, heavenly beings, holy beings, and stars. And then this is where it gets tricky. It uses language we're not comfortable with. Elohim, which we often translate God. Problem is Elohim can be used plural and singular, and there are times where it's used in the plural, where it means multiple gods or divine beings. Now, semantically, that's tough for us, so I'm going to explain that as we go. Psalm 82, verse 1, and then Psalm 82, verse 6. God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. I said, this is verse 6, I said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. Now, I have to be honest. When I first saw that text, I had difficulty. When I first saw it, some of our translations don't even know how to handle it, so they don't translate it. But the word there, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because in the Hebrew, you have the word Elohim. It's there in both places. Some of our translations might translate that host of heaven, or they might change it, but the actual word is the same word that we also often translate God. Now, why might that be a problem for us? This is the part where I ask you a question and you answer me back. Say what? Because there's one God, right? So we read about other gods and we think, is the Bible contradicting itself? The problem that we have is just the problem of the language. Gods simply means other divine beings. And we can all admit that. Angels are divine beings. Angels are immortal beings. They are created, but they don't have to. One of the reasons that they don't have to procreate and they don't have sexuality or gender as humans do is because since they're eternal, they don't have to make more of them. Like that's one of the difference between us and angels is we're not eternal, so we have to have kids to make sure humans stay alive. Angels, the sons of God, don't have to do that. Now, if we think of it as God's Elohim, meaning anything that's divine, anything that is in this other realm, the supernatural realm, and instead of just using the word God, we understand that God is the supreme creator, and God's simply means anything that is in that other realm. I think it's easier for us to understand. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? If we can get away from the word God and what we attach to that and think about gods being anything, including angels and divine spirits and presence and all of that stuff that's in the supernatural world, including God, and understanding that God is the creator, the only one that is eternal, then I think we can get that. I think that makes a little bit more sense. We're just talking about something that is not of the created realm, it's of the unseen realm. So there's also another thing, and that's kind of the terms there I kind of want us to wrap our mind around. The Elohim, which are these other beings that are under God. They are not God as we understand God, but they are supernatural in the sense that angels are. And I want us to get our minds around holy ones and heavenly beings and stars and all of these things that are these celestial beings. That represents the host of heaven. That represents the divine council, the multitudes, right, that are around God's throne. So there's a degree of hierarchy. So angels, these divine beings with different ranks. But we're going to wait till we get to the New Testament to talk about that, because I think that's easier to get once we get to the New Testament. But these are all terms that describe the nature of the divine council, what we have come to know as angels. What I want to suggest is all of those different things I mentioned are what we would understand as angels. In the Old Testament, we have several terms and terms that describe their function, what they do. But all of those different terms that I used are what we would use to describe something we commonly just use one word for. And that's why the Old Testament is a little bit tricky, because it's got all of these different words to describe these beings that live in heaven with God. Now, angels in the Old Testament have different functions. This divine council has different functions. The one we're most familiar with would be the word malach or malachim, which means messenger. And that's what gets translated angel in the Old Testament. Now, that is not describing a certain being. That is describing what one of the divine council does. So you've got all of this host of God. And we know that they're around God, they advise God, and they carry out tasks for God. And so one that is carrying a message or the presence of God from heaven to earth is a malach or a malachim, which means messenger, and that's what we translate angel. Now, almost all the time, these messengers show up in human form. Let me give you an example that you're familiar with. Abraham and Sarah. Who comes to their tent? 3 men, right? That's what it says in Genesis 18:2. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby, When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. These were the three men that announced Sarah would be able to have a child. And remember, Sarah laughed when these messengers said that, and then she didn't tell the truth about laughing. All those things happened. But then we know in chapter 19, verse 1, that those weren't just men, because one of those men sent the other two to Sodom and Gomorrah to do what? Destroy it. And in 19, verse 1, the word used to describe those two men is the two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And what you'll notice is when men meet these angels, they almost always worship when they figure out what it is. And very often, what the angel tells them to do is, don't worship me, worship God. We get that in Revelation, right? When John falls down before the angel in Revelation chapter 1, the angel says, do not worship me, worship God. So we see that very often. Another thing they do is they're ministers. Psalm 103:20 says, bless the Lord, ye angels. I actually got this, I used the King James for a few of these. That excel in strength, that do his commandments, hearkening unto the voice of the Lord. Bless ye the Lord, all ye hosts, ye ministers. And if you're in the NIV or something, it may say servants. Ye ministers of his that do his pleasure. So angels serve as God's ministers, as God's servants to carry out God's will on earth. The watchers, Daniel chapter 4, verse 13 calls them watchers. It says, I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. Now that actually comes back to Genesis chapter 6. And in the intertestamental period, the book of Enoch, first Enoch talks about the watchers that saw the daughters of men and came down, and the sons of God had children with the daughters of men. And the word watcher is used frequently in first Enoch, but it's only used in Daniel in the Old Testament. Host, mighty ones, and what this means, the angelic host would be the armies of God. So 1 Samuel 4 talks about the Lord of hosts. So the people sent to Shiloh that they may bring from thence the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts. That's what that phrase means. When we hear the Lord of hosts, it means the Lord over this host, this multitude of angels. And then finally, they can serve as a mediator. Job 33:23 says, if there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000 to declare to man what is right for him. So angels can mediate between us and God. Finally, another function, and I hate that I don't have, because I've got really great pictures of this, because pictures help us understand this, but I think I can help you get it. We have cherubim and seraphim. Now, we tend to think of cherubim and seraphim as kind of certain kinds of angels, or maybe just a different name for angels. What I would argue is that this is kind of like the special forces of heaven. Like they're like the Navy SEALs of heaven. The cherubim and seraphim show up in places to protect the divine presence. And what they do is they bring comfort to those that are in God's presence, that are close to God, and at the same time, they strike fear into the enemies of God. Now, cherubim and seraphim, and this is where I wish I had the picture to show you. When we think of cherubs, what do we think of? Yeah, chubby little babies. I think I heard someone, we think of chubby little babies, and we think of Cupid with his little arrow. That is not what a cherub is. A cherub is terrifying. That's why a cherub was put in front of the garden to guard the entrance of the garden after Adam and Eve were kicked out, right? That's why cherubs were put in the tabernacle and in the temple to guard the Ark of the Covenant. Seraphim Similar, these guardian seraphim, we have this picture of seraphim in Isaiah where they are around the presence of God. And most people would argue that the angels around God in Revelation, even though they're not called seraphim, if I remember correctly, would be seraphim. And they are these guardians that guard holy places. Seraphim and cherubim are never the angels that go communicate with people. They're never the angels that relay messages. They're never angels that show up and even carry the presence of God. They are there for defense. They are there as, again, kind of like, I remember I was reading about Navy SEALs and Army Special Forces. I read a lot of stuff that, I don't know, I read stuff that you guys would not expect me to read. I read a lot of military stuff and books on different wars and actions and that kind of thing. And I was reading about one of the SEAL teams that was in Fallujah, and that the Iraqis that were there, the enemy insurgent and the friendlies, thought that these guys were invincible. Like they were so proficient in combat that they thought they were almost otherworldly, right? That they just could not be killed, was kind of the way that they felt. Now, if we read, we know that those guys do get killed from time to time. So they're certainly not immortal. But when we think of the cherubim and seraphim, we need to think of them like those Iraqis or foreign soldiers thought of our special forces. These are divine presences to be feared. They are terrifying. A better way, when you think of cherub and seraphim, think of like the great sphinx. Instead of thinking of an angel, think of like a great sphinx. And in Mesopotamia, they had these two, and it looks like maybe it's on a lion's body with wings, and maybe it has the face of a person. Sometimes it may have the face of an ox, or it may have the face of a different kind of animal. All of this is meant to be terrifying because it is protecting the holy presence of God. Now, and if you remember all the way, oh, Sally, go ahead. Okay, let me, this goes all the way back, and we'll talk about this when we get into the narrative of the story, but God's presence, because part of the rebellion of the heavenly host that rebelled against God was they crossed over this sacred divide, right? So the angels in heaven crossed over, and they saw the daughters of men, and that is considered by most people the start of this angelic rebellion. Like you've got Satan or the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, which would be the first divine creature to rebel. But then the wholesale rebel would be back to Genesis 6. And we'll talk about that. It doesn't seem like very much. It's hard for us to understand it. But once we follow the narrative, all of a sudden it just kind of opens everything up. But it's the idea of protecting anything from the created world from getting into the sacred realm is the idea. Because, let me give you another example. We know about ritual purity, right? That like if you were sick, you can't go into the tabernacle, or if someone is losing any kind of fluid, right? Without getting too technical, because I'll get embarrassed if I talk too deeply about some of this stuff that keeps you from going into the divine presence in the Old Testament. What the ancient world thought was that what made people mortal was that we lose these fluids. So if someone was unclean, it wasn't that they were bad or they did something wrong. It's just losing that fluid represented death. And so they couldn't come into the divine presence because angelic beings, they didn't lose fluid. None of that stuff happened. They didn't have blood and these different things that they lost. So if you lost blood, you could not come into the divine presence because you might be bringing that in with you, was the idea. So it's more this idea. It's not that God needs protection as much as showing there is no way for God to be corrupted. Does that make more sense? They're around God and they're protecting God. And it's a show of force to us that we can have security in God because God cannot be corrupted, because he's got this powerful special forces around him that is keeping anything from corrupting God and making God unholy in any way, if that makes sense. Does that kind of help, Sally? So, and we've got the cherubim. I'm going to read a few passages. Exodus 25:20. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, their faces one to another. Toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubim be. So they're all facing in. They're watching God. They're protecting that space. Exodus 37:9. The cherubim spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, with their faces one to another. Again, this is inside the tabernacle space, which the ancient world thought, when you were where the tabernacle was, inside the tabernacle where the Ark of the Covenant, they thought that was where heaven and earth met. It was a thin space. It was very protected because it was where you could come in to that heavenly presence. Ezekiel 1:10, this is talking about a seraphim. Their faces look like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being on the right side and the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. And then back to Genesis 3:24, the garden, after Adam and Eve were kicked out, there was a cherub and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So those are the different functions that angels have. They have messengers. That's the word we generally translate angel, malach or malachim. They're mediators, ministers, watchers, heavenly hosts, and cherubim and seraphim, which is more akin to a more militaristic protection of the holy realm. I want to go through, and we've got time to do this, I want to go through the different angels that we see show up in the Old Testament real quick. So we're familiar. Does anybody know any angels by name? Michael and Gabriel. Anybody know any others? Okay, yeah, make an argument that he is a fallen angel, right? Anybody know any other angels that are not fallen? The names of any more? That's a trick question. I probably shouldn't do that. There's not any more. It's just Gabriel and Michael. Those are the only two that we have by name that are not fallen. Anybody know how many of them show up in the New Testament? Just one. Michael's the only one that shows up in Jude chapter 6. He's the only one that shows up by name. Now, in the Apocrypha and in the Pseudepigrapha, the Testamental, they give more of them names. There's 7 of them. Now, this is interesting because we have how many angels in Revelation with how many churches? 7. Yeah. These are archangels, which are considered commander angels. We'll talk about that more when we get to the New Testament. So even though there's only 2 of these named in the Old Testament and only one of them named in the New Testament, there's 7 named in between, and there's 7 angels over 7 churches. We'll talk about that more. We get into really interesting stuff when we get there. The first angel I want to talk about is the angel of the Lord. The angel also called Yahweh. Shows up in Exodus 23:20. See, I'm sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. 21. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion since my name is in him. If you listen carefully to what he says and do all, listen to this, that I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and will oppose to those you oppose. Interestingly enough, where does the angel begin? Or where does the angel end? And where does God begin? That gets more confusing. It doesn't get less confusing. Judges 2:1. Listen to the language here. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, listen to this. The angel of the Lord went up and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. Who led the Israelites up? Who swore to give this land to them? Was it the angel or was it God? Here, it gets a little confusing, doesn't it? You see that through the Old Testament. Here's another example, Genesis 31:11. The angel of God said to me, the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. I answered, here am I. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with a flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. Now listen to this part. So 31:11 says, the angel of God said to me in a dream. Then down in 13, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Did Jacob make a vow to an angel? Or did Jacob make a vow to God? See how the language gets confusing here? And also, well, before I get to that, what I want to say and suggest, and we'll follow this, I don't know how far deep we can get into this, but it seems even in ancient Judaism, they had the two Yahweh, a two Yahweh doctrine or theology. Now, they quit having that. They called it heretical after the 2nd century. And the reason they called it heretical after the 2nd century, because you know what it started sounding too much like? The Trinity. It started sounding too much like the Trinity. So it seems like there is even though it's all the same God, it seems like there is a God that is spirit, that is identified one way, and whenever God shows up in bodily form, you have an embodied Yahweh. And even though it's God, the idea, and that some people, and I'm not saying this is one of those things where I think it's interesting, and I'm not quite where I can jump 2 feet right in the middle of it yet, if that makes sense. I'm almost convinced, but I can't quite put 2 feet right in the middle of this. But what a lot of people say is that what the New Testament writers did and what Jesus represented was that God come in bodily form. So that spirit of Yahweh may have represented on some of the embodied, what now, since Jesus was incarnated, we could see as Jesus now. See, the Jews rejected that in about the 2nd century because, again, it sounded too much began to sound like Christianity and like the Trinity. Now, the reason that that's intriguing to me is because you have this text in Exodus 33:20, where God said, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. What's the problem with that? People have seen God's face and lived, right? So is this contradicting itself? Or is it not? Right? Is it something else going on? What I suggest is that people can see the embodied Yahweh, which would represent this angel of Yahweh, which shows up in physical form, yet no one can see the spirit Yahweh and live. No one can breach that sacred realm and come back, right? God can show up in physical form, and even though it's the same God, something about it is also different. So it's all one God, one creator, and we get into the mystery of the Trinity with that. I'm going to slow down there because that's a big rock I just dumped into your pond, and ask if anybody's got a question about that before I move on. Yeah, I'm talking about in the New Testament, Jesus. And what we know is that Jesus was with God in creation. It tells us that in John chapter 1, right? John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we know from reading on down that text that is Jesus. And so we know Jesus's presence is there. And so what a lot of scholars, and I think this is intriguing. I won't jump in there 100%, but what they think is that that same presence might be represented in the embodied Yahweh that shows up in the Old Testament, which is different than the man Jesus that was born of Mary, because Jesus had to be born of a person to be able to redeem us and pay the blood price for us. But at the same time, we know Jesus's presence was with God from the very beginning, that Jesus is God. Jesus was not, or that the Son was with God. The Son was not created. It's been with God eternally, right? So what a lot of people would say was that embodied presence might also be the presence of the Son that became Jesus after God was born of Mary. Doesn't that just make your head want to explode, me just saying that? But it kind of helps us make sense of some of this in the Old Testament, where we recognize that people are interacting with God face to face, even though the Bible tells us that no one can do that. So maybe God's presence embodied, even though it's still God, is different than God the Father in the spirit realm. Scott? Yeah, God embodied. Anytime God shows up, it's not God going into someone. In the Old Testament, anytime God shows up in a physical form, right? So like the angel that shows up in the burning bush, that'd be another example. The angel that goes before the people that led them out of Israel, the angel of the Lord that spoke to Jacob in the dream, those would all be examples. So here's another example of an angel in the Old Testament, the commander of Yahweh's army that Joshua sees in Joshua 5:13. We don't know which angel that is. Maybe it's Michael, maybe it's Gabriel. It looks like when we read Daniel closely, there's another angel that can command Gabriel, and it looks like this may even be the presence of God, because the same language is used in Joshua 5:13 that's used in front of the burning bush, where it says in verse 15, 5:15, the commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." Joshua did so. Where else did that happen? Burning bush, right? The destroying angel of the Passover, that's another place where the language gets confusing, where you have the text says, "I will pass over you, no destructive plague will touch you," and then it's also called the destroyer, so that's another example. And then we have Gabriel and Michael that we've already talked about. So, is everybody's head effectively mush now after all of that? Maybe not. So where this will make sense, so I'll give you 2 weeks. I'll put these texts on the website, and I've got literally hundreds of texts that I can pull and show you too, that you can read through if you're interested beyond what I put on the website, and we'll take a look at those and see what they think. Once we get into the New Testament, this stuff will kind of come together and begin to make more sense and be a little bit easier for us to grasp. It's 7:28. I got time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. I want to make sure I honor everybody's time. So what, Jim? Oh. Let me tell you the main thing to take away from this with the Old Testament. When we think of angels, as we think of them, and the way that we're going to use that language the rest of this time, what we want to think of is the divine council, the council that surrounds God. And when they come into our realm, they are angels. And so we'll see those spirits, and we'll see them show up in the New Testament, where they will interpret dreams, where they will show up, where they will take on the appearance of humans. Sometimes they will take on the appearance of what look like divine beings. But what we want to remember is when we're thinking about angels, we're thinking about God's heavenly host that stay loyal to God. And when we think about fallen angels and when we think about demons, we want to be thinking about the heavenly host that rebelled against God. And if we can remember those two things, it'll really help us understand angels. Thank you guys for being here tonight. Thank you for, if this was too difficult or I said anything too crazy, you got to go easy on me because it's my birthday. I'm going to pull that card. But thank everybody for being here. I'm going to say a prayer and then we'll be dismissed.